Good afternoon or morning to all those who are attending us today. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Executive Insights series. We're excited to have you here, and this was originally going to be planned as an in-person event, but like everything else, we have gone to a digital format. So thank you for tuning in today. This is being recorded, so if for any reason you need to step away from your device, don't worry, we'll be sending the full recording out to you later today. I'm really excited to be joined by my partners. I'm representing the Emory Alumni Association with our alumni learning programs, and we've joined together with the Goizueta Business School, Goizueta Executive Education Programming, and our Emory corporate partners to deliver the third of the series presented by faculty and executive thought leaders on how executives must adapt to a changing business landscape. And we have definitely had a lot of change in these last several months. With the pandemic now upon us, we see it quite fitting to move forward with this series and continuing to address the constant changing topics that we're all facing. After a public health crisis and how we're going to lead in uncertainty and leaning on our Emory thought leaders to bring this to us. With this, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Nicola Barrett. And just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can after the presentation. Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Lane. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. We work with organizations, executives, and professionals to equip leaders with the mindset, skill sets, and tool sets needed to meet their business challenges today and tomorrow. One thing that has captured our imaginations is the question about what is a modern growth organization and what is the role and the capabilities required of a modern growth leader. A couple of months ago, Professor Anandhi Bharadwaj was featured in an Atlanta Business Chronicle article on operational strategies that create, capture, and deliver new growth. In this article, she is quoted as saying, you have to think about an operating model that is conceived in the digital world, and then how this spawns new growth opportunities. Then you need to think about how to build the required operating model. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Anandhi so that we can understand this better. Anandhi is the Vice Dean for Faculty and Research, the Goizueta Endowed Chair in Electronic Commerce, and the Professor of Information Systems, Operations Management at Goizueta Business School, and a great colleague. Anandhi, in your work, you've examined digital strategies and how firms are responding to the threat of digital disruptions. What do you see today in terms of the digital forces that are currently shaping business practices? And what is it about the design of organizations and technology that you believe needs to change?
Great. Thank you, Nicola. Wonderful to be here. And thank you so much for the opportunity today to present in this webinar series and talk a little bit about my work, especially as it relates to digital transformation and what I mean by designing operating strategies in a world gone digital. So for over two decades, I have been studying organizations, their business practices, and their strategies, especially as it relates to their responses to technological change. Over the years, I've looked at as technologies and digital technologies themselves have evolved and changed, how have businesses across a wide spectrum of organizations, how have they responded in terms of aligning their technology and their technology architecture, and how do they derive value from their business investments? So that has broadly been my focus of research. But what has really changed, especially this decade and more so over the last 5 years, is that the nature of digital technology and the nature of change itself is changing. And that is what I want to argue in today's presentation. I will talk about the speed of disruptive change. I mean, we constantly hear words like digital disruption and digital transformation today. You talk to any senior business leader and you will hear those terms. I think a lot of organizations are definitely on the path of digital transformation, but I think many organizations are still gearing up for the way things were. They want to use technology, but use technology to be better along the lines that they were already operating. What I'm arguing for is some fundamental shifts that organizations need to make in terms of their design, what I call as designing for a digital world. So with that as sort of the backdrop for the talk today, let me just give you a roadmap for what I want to really focus on. And I want to do today's talk in two parts. One is kind of looking back about what digital really meant. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time looking back, but I think it is important for us to remind ourselves about how organizations have continuously sort of experienced shifts in technology, right? Every era or every decade, if we look back over the last 4 or 5 decades, we've seen major technological shifts. And I think it is important for us to remind ourselves about how organizations have responded to these shifts, what kinds of changes have they made with respect to their processes, their business processes, their applications, the way they manage their data, and what has really happened in terms of these business responses. How have they thought about the change in terms of the value that they got from their business investments, right? So that would be sort of the look back. But then if I start to look at what is really happening today and maybe even anticipate for the next 5 years or so, technology moves so fast, none of us can sort of pretend to know the future. But if you look at the new digital drivers, I think you can see sort of where the big shifts and the big changes are occurring and where they're coming from. So what are the new digital drivers today? And therefore, what do organizations need to do in terms of not just enveloping their current products and services in an information envelope, but really think about fundamentally changed digital offerings, which are really information-enriched solutions for customers, understanding where they are in their life cycle and where the organization needs to be serving them. We've also seen fundamental shifts to just digital business models of organizations, right? So I want to talk about some of those shifts and then make the argument that the technology platform which organizations had geared up till now has largely been focused on efficiency and doing the things that I do better. Now that is absolutely necessary. You've got to operate in today's environment and do business and be successful in today's environment like you've been doing, but you also need to be simultaneously planning for the future. So I'm going to argue that you have to develop a technology platform that is geared for agility and growth in the future. So that's kind of the broad roadmap and the landscape of what I'm going to be presenting today. So the first part, just looking back a bit, right? If we start to think about the evolution of digital technology over the last, and as much as we've seen change, and you and I, Nicola, in our careers, in our life, experiences in organizations, we have seen many of these changes and many of these eras of and decades of computing, right? But yet when I think back and I just look at this chart, it amazes me that it's just 50 years or so, right? Just in the last 4 or 5 decades that all of these changes have taken place. Some of us on today's call, today's webinar, may have cut our teeth in the first decade when organizations just started to think about and start to use computers largely for computing, right? For transaction processing and their back office processes. So really, if you think back about the history of business computing, it's really only about 5 decades old. And through the 70s and 80s, much more of a centralized architecture. But then as we shifted, you might recall, for example, 1980 was the year that IBM introduced the personal computer, right? So the first PCs came onto the scene and all the organizations and especially the managers, not Excel, the first spreadsheet applications back then were the killer apps as they were called. And all the business managers wanted their own spreadsheets and their own data processing ability and capability and so forth. But this led to a proliferation of disparate systems, which then in the 90s, we saw a move towards sort of rationalizing and bringing that into a much more of an organized way of managing, right? So the computing infrastructure led to, terms like client-server architectures. And also we saw in the 90s, all of us remember it as the decade of the starting of the internet, but it was also the decade of enterprise systems, systems like ERP and customer relationship management and supply chain management. So sort of these large enterprise architecture systems came onto the scene, which allowed for companies to start to get a full and a more integrated view of their organizations. Followed that with the decade, and it was also, I think, leading up to the decade of the 2002. And in many ways, I think, you know, sort of the Y2K was a catalyst, because organizations knew that they had all these disparate and inefficient systems that needed to be transformed if they were to enter the new era of the 2000 and be successful. So that with the Y2K, we also saw a big push towards outsourcing, you know, bringing new providers, technology providers from other parts of the world to manage our computing systems. And then, of course, we've seen the era of mobile technologies. The first decade in the new century was all about social media and mobile technologies. And most recently, in the current decade, we've seen artificial intelligence, cloud, IoT devices. So you name it, every era or every decade has seen major progression. And with all of these changes in technologies, organizations and businesses have responded with changes in sort of just the way the organizational structure itself. We've seen it lead to a more flattening, decentralized organizations. We've seen changes in decision rights and decision allocation of decision rights. We've also seen changes overall in corporate governance, right? So the businesses have been responding successively to each of these generations in technologies. But if, again, as I look back to the business response to these digital technologies, a lot of the participants in today's call might recognize this is sort of a very standard way in which many organizations used to think about their digital architecture as a stack, right? If you think of it as a stack of hardware or technology layered on top of which are my applications, my data, and my business processes, it was not uncommon to see each business unit. If I think of a large organization like a Home Depot or a Delta, right? It was not uncommon to see each business unit have its own technology stack of hardware, applications, data, and processes, right? So what we have come to understand as business silos, a very siloed view of technology, where, you know, the fundamentally, while this allowed each of them to respond to the changes that they saw in their own marketplaces, for the entire firm, it really did not yield any sort of unified view of the customer. You were not able to really draw on efficiencies that you might otherwise had over your entire supply chain. There were a lot of opportunities for leverage in but not having a common platform and shared services. There was a lot of replication and a lot of redundancy of data and a redundancy of applications and processes. But this was a very common way in which organizations had organized their technology infrastructure up even until the 90s. And many organizations, I would argue, are still in some sort of siloed architecture. Although I think some of the leading organizations in many industries have shifted and have changed to what we call as having some sort of an operational core, right? Where we can think of having standard and shared networks and infrastructure services, where you have some shared technology across. If you think about the stack, what is it that is common across our business applications? Where do we need to be unique, and where do we need to be have shared services? Think of a large bank. Now this allows me to have a single view of the customer. Maybe you have a checking account in my bank. Maybe you have a mortgage account and you have a car loan account. In the past, banks did not really have a single unified view of the customer, and each business unit was responding with its own offers and its own business plans. But having a single shared view now allows you to have a better understanding of the customer in their life cycle stages and come up with better products and better offerings, right? So this is sort of where I think a lot of organizations have shifted, although I think at this point, maybe it might be good to invite some participation from our webinar participants. And I'm going to maybe ask them where they think they are in their organizations. As they look at this picture, and this, by the way, is I'm drawing on some work from a good friend and colleague, Jeannie Ross at MIT, who also talks about sort of this enterprise architecture and the move to operational efficiencies and improved business processes as companies have started to think about technology in a shared services model. So let me pause for a minute or move to another screen. And if there's any sort of reactions or responses at this point, I'm also happy to take some quick questions. But I want to run a short and a quick poll. Let me pull up the poll, which, oops, I'm sorry.
While that poll is pulling up for us, I just chatted the poll to you all. So if you go to menti.com, the code is 429743. We'll go ahead and get those responses.
Right. So, right. So really trying to figure out in my organization, the operational backbone, a common set of coherent systems. What stage are we seeing in today's organizations? Fully developed and functional, still under development, non-existent, each unit still doing its own thing. And I think the responses are still coming in. I'm going to pause for a minute or two to see if there are more responses coming. And we already see sort of the middle bar still under development with many disparate systems.
Pretty close.
Pretty close, yeah, yeah. In fact, I think this may be quite reflective of what has been happening with US corporations, and a larger scale survey of this done with Fortune 500 companies showed roughly, and these were some of the leading firms, right? So these were the Fortune 500 companies, some of the leading firms. Even there, what they found was it was about 30%, slightly less than 30%, about 28%, that said that they had a full operational core with complete visibility across their entire organization. Fully developed and functional was less than 30%. And the remaining 70% were about 40% in the middle. Many organizations see the need for connecting across their business silos, see the need for understanding the customer journey and pathway throughout the organization and throughout their life cycle stages, but are not quite there. And roughly about 30% are still, non-existent and have allowed each business unit to do its own thing. I think we are kind of seeing somewhere in that range here as well, with a much smaller percentage on the fully developed side of it. Cole, should I go back? Are you seeing more responses come in, or can we go back?
I think we can go back.
Okay.
Anandhi.
All right. Thank you. And I think that what we see is pretty typical of where organizations are in terms of the business response to these technologies. And that is, it is difficult because the pace of technological change is quite rapid. And with every era calling for new technologies, as well as new applications and new processes that are designed to leverage these new technologies, it takes years for organizations to catch up. And this is something that actually relates to a lot of my work, where I've looked at why is it that firms take a lot, what is the lag, right? Why is there such a long lag from the time they make their investments in technology to when they actually start to see the value. And that's because of you need a lot of complementary investments, because anytime you talk about technology, you have to always think people, processes, and applications, right? All of those have to evolve and change along with changes in your technology investments. And even as companies have tried to shift to an operational core with the goal of having, like I said, end-to-end view of a customer journey, a single view of data, or a single point of truth, as companies call it, all of the core transactions being completely computerized, we have seen that the focus has largely been on sort of improved efficiency, increased responses to opportunities for scale, increased focus on leveraging economies of scale, reliabilities of systems, and continuous improvement. Now, all of this is great. All of this is needed to deliver on your current proposition, right? To improve your operations, to deliver based on your current business models. But what has really happened, and here's where I kind of want to shift to the second part, is while businesses have largely been focused on looking at digital from the point of view of operational excellence, today we have to have a different mindset as well about how we think about digital technologies and the opportunities of digital. And that is really where I want to focus the second part, or the next part of my talk, in terms of what has changed. What are these new digital drivers? Where do we see these forces of change coming from? And what should be the business response or the organizational response towards these new drivers? So let me sort of shift a little bit to talk about the changing nature of digital innovation. What do I mean by that? As I talked about these 4 or 5 decades of changes in technology, I like to think of it as the 4 C's, right? We started with using computers for computing in organizations, like transaction processing, which then in the 90s, we started connecting our computers. So it was all about connectivity. And then in the first decade of 2000, it was all about social media and communication platforms became the dominant model for organizing your processes. And now and commerce. So the 4th C has also been commerce in the last 2 decades. But if you think about these changes, it's been largely sort of linear and continuous. You could see that, yes, computing power was increasing significantly. There was going to be more opportunities to handle larger transaction volumes, to do more in terms of our business processes, to connect our business processes, and so forth. But what has really shifted today and just in this last few years in this decade is that the nature of digital innovation is no longer just linear and continuous, but in fact it is, I'm going to argue, is exponential and combinatorial. What do I mean by exponential and combinatorial? Right? We all know the familiar story of digital computing, the computing power itself. We've seen the growth curves, the exponential power, the Moore's law as we know it, where computing power has literally doubled every 3 or 4 years, right? The exponential growth of computing power. But along with that, we've also seen the exponential growth of adoption and take-in of new technologies, right? That has been fairly new in terms of, if I look back, we did not have the exponential growth that we've seen before in terms of just the adoption and the intake of these of computer systems. Look at the adoption of Facebook, look at the adoption of social media technologies. We've all seen the exponential growth curves in terms of how consumer technologies especially have been adopted at rates that we have not seen before, right? If you compare it to the number of years that it took for people to adopt just regular telephone technology or TVs, and you compare that to the rate of adoption of mobile phones or social media technologies, that has been exponential. right? So we now see the growth rate of change and the adoption of consumer technologies growing at an exponential rate. The next part of the change, which I'm talking about as going from linear, is also a combinatorial. What do I mean by combinatorial? Each wave of innovation has spurred additional innovations. And if you think about these layers of innovation, each building on the next, we have now seen this has unleashed massive new waves of innovation that just feeds and builds on each other, causing change at rates that we have not seen before. Let me give you some examples of the new digital drivers and what we mean when we think about them in a combinatorial sense. So if you think of sort of digital and exponential and combinatorial and all sort of building on each other, that I'm arguing is sort of led to these massive shifts in how organizations are experiencing these change. So what are these game changers, right? The first one is in terms of all of these, I just talked about adoption of consumer technologies, the smart connected devices, the millions and millions of billions of smart connected devices all across the globe that are constantly collecting data, sensing, seeing, what customers are engaged in as they go through their daily activities, whether it's commuting to work or entering a building, changing the digital thermostat to change my temperature, to change the room temperature. My phone is constantly tracking where I'm going, where I'm shopping, where I'm stopping. So if you think about all of these billions of devices constantly generating data and feeding into what we now call the cloud, right? Which is really allowing us to capture, store, and analyze all of this, the big data, right? So when we talk about big data, we talk about sort of the velocity at which the data is being collected and the volume at which the data is being collected, and also the variety of new data. It's not just, data as we used to think about it in terms of text and numbers. It's video data, it's voice data, it's all of these other types of data from other devices that are being collected as well. So we've got the devices that are feeding in, and then we've got the technology now to capture, store, and analyze the data. And then the piece of the combinatorial layer, as I think about, is all the insights, right? So companies are, the ones that have these sensors are deluged by data. First of all, not all of these companies, not all businesses, I think, have started to think about what are the opportunities, where should my sensors be placed, right? What is it that I'm not seeing about my consumers in their life cycle that is relevant to my products and services, right? The second part is even if I do have the sensors and I'm capturing the data, what am I doing with that? So not all businesses are geared up to have made the changes to exploit the opportunities of big data. And the third layer is the AI and ML. How do I derive the insights from this data? And as these insights come, that in turn allows us to think about, go back and think about where more sensors are needed, or what kinds of additional data do I have opportunities to collect, and so forth, right? So each of these layers sort of build and connect. And that's what I mean by the combinatorial. So these changes have not just been exponential, but together it has caused massive shifts in almost every industry. The value chains have been disrupted, new business models have emerged, platform-based business models have emerged. And I'm going to talk about some of these key shifts that we've seen, that just especially over the last decade, which is which in essence is really because of these the combinatorial nature of all of these technologies that have changed the business world as we know it.
Anandhi, just a question there. Do you see this sort of applying to all industries? I mean, higher ed, for example, being a service I mean, essentially we provide a service. We don't have smart connected devices. We have some data, we have some sort of technologies, but there are other, consulting as well. I'm just curious about whether or not this applies to all types of businesses, and whether or not you need to have, already invested
Right.
in those, or, is Amazon going to come and eat our lunch too?
Well, they very well might, right, Nicola? So I think, yeah, that's a good question. And I would argue that absolutely we need to figure out what are those sensors, right? Where do we need to know? What do we need to know about the people that we serve, our students and other stakeholders that we serve? A good analogy is the newspaper industry, right? I think if you look back over the last couple of decades in the newspaper industry, they were all about the business of creation, distribution, and leverage of news. Right? Now, what happened is the bundle of a newspaper made sense, right? It held together as a bundle because of, as I'm collecting the news and distributing and leveraging it, the revenue model was largely based on advertisements and advertising revenue, which was really subsidizing the news business. So the entire bundle held together and made a lot of logical sense. But what started to happen with the internet and with some of these technologies coming in is that that bundle started to fall apart, right? New players were entering the market that were leveraging some of those of the key parts of that value chain. So for example, when Craigslist entered and the advertisements started to go away for the newspaper industry, that's when they figured out that the entire bundle of news production and distribution was something that was not sustainable without the ad revenue. And a lot of newspapers, the smaller ones, actually collapsed and have not sort of recovered at all. The smarter ones, the bigger, the ones that had some deep pockets to invest in new technologies, have actually now, I think, come up with new business models. For example, subscription-based revenue models where they have figured out what is it that consumers are willing to pay for, what is it that consumers really want and are willing to pay for. So if you think about universities, we are a bundle like that too, Nicola, in higher education, right? We've got our research arm, we are in the business of, similar to the newspaper industry, we are in the business of knowledge creation, knowledge dissemination, and knowledge leverage, right? And so we've got some aspects, the revenue largely coming from research grants and tuition that supports everything that we do. We really have to ask ourselves, as we see newer and nimble competitors coming in who may be leveraging some skills-based and other kinds of learning, what is it, how do we support, how does the entire bundle hold? And I would argue that we need to be doing some similar things to really understand what is it in terms of the life stage or the life cycle of learning. What do we want to, what do we need to understand about our consumers or the stakeholders? And one way for us might be, are there sort of subscription-based models for universities going into the future where you've got people looking at and saying, for an annual subscription, I have some of these classes that I might be willing to take, and then have some opportunities to come in and engage with the professors in the university. So the point I'm making is that we actually need to have those sensors along, and the sensors may be in terms of connected devices, but they also may be sort of in terms of the reach that we have with our alumni, with our corporate partners. Where in their life cycle stages are we sensing their needs for learning, their needs for new knowledge, and how then are we leveraging what we learn about our consumers? And then that insight should drive the design of our new modules, new courses, new plans, and so forth. So I think this model largely is something that holds for every business, because it's really about sensing and responding, right? How do we sense what it is that the consumers are engaging in as they go through their life stages and life cycle transitions? How do we then leverage that data, and what kinds of insights do we feed back from the data to change our digital offerings. So I think this is what I mean by sort of the combinatorial aspect of these digital technologies. So in the past, when we talked about digital as being sort of fundamentally about operational excellence, what we are seeing now with these shifts, with these exponential and combinatorial shifts, is that the new economics of digital has unleashed fundamentally new rules of competition. So in the remaining time, I just want to walk through some quick shifts that we have all experienced as consumers. Many of us have seen our companies being subjected to some of these new rules of competition. And this is, again, just a quick walkthrough. Not all businesses may have experienced all these shifts, but if I look back and ask the question, what shifts have these digital technologies unleashed across firms, across a variety of industries? Here are some major shifts that I've seen over the last decade, right? So shift number one, in terms of the digital innovation, I would argue, is really exploiting the power of the long tail. What is the power of the long tail? Understanding that our consumers are spread across the entire tail. It used to be that, in the case that we were largely serving customers at the head of the tail and not at the end of the tail, right? Because if you understand that customers have heterogeneous preferences, most of the product and services have really been geared towards the top of the tail or the head, whereas as I go through the long tail, there are niche products and niche offerings that we can provide our customers, which really exploits the entire preference chain of all our consumers. Now, this is easy to do in digital products or services because the cost of inventory and the cost of offering new products or services is almost is trivial, right? But even in the case of physical products, I would argue that now with new technologies like 3D printing and the opportunity to create multiple versions of the same product that are highly personalized, what you really see is the power to serve customers along the entire distribution, not just focus on the top of the distribution, where if you think about physical retailers, we used to argue the 80-20, right? 80% of my revenue comes from 20% of the customers, but you were really serving only one segment of your population with the most preferred products. But as we go down the curve, you've got a lot of opportunities to serve all your customers with very niche products and products much more personalized to their taste and to their preference. How do they find the variety of products that we have, right? Variety of services. Again, in the case of digital goods, it has been largely, the power of the recommendation engine, which has really been, if you think about companies like Amazon that have used these recommendation engines to help consumers know all the other products. So if you like Britney Spears, you're likely to also like this song or this musician, right? And so use the power of the recommendation engine to force consumers to go along the entire tail to sample different products and services. So that's one thing that we have to, I think with the digital shift, you have to really ask yourself, how much do I know all the heterogeneous tastes and preferences of all my consumers? Am I serving only a key segment and missing the opportunities along the rest of the distribution, especially along the ends of the tail? So that's a shift that we've seen largely in digital products, but you can argue that similar sort of opportunities exist across digital and non-digital products as well. The second shift is just digital has deconstructed value chains. What do I mean by deconstructed value chains? If you think of value chain, we all understand that as sort of the linear steps or the linear stages as a product moves from design and creation through production to distribution to marketing and final delivery, right? Now, in the past, as I look through a value chain, the information flows tended to stay very close to the physical flows of the product, right? What do I mean by that? all the information about inventory or about the product itself really stayed very close to the actual location of the product. So if I needed to find out if a hotel was available, I had to call the hotel to find out if a room was available. If I needed a car, I needed to go to a dealer to find out what models and makes and what colors they had in their inventory lot. So the information about the product remained fairly close to the physical value chain as the product moved through the value chain. But we've seen that completely decimated, especially as new digital native companies have entered all of these industries. So today, all I need to know is not, if I want to be in the hotel industry, I just need to know whether a room is available, who's willing to rent the room, at what price, and which consumer is willing to come and stay there. Think Airbnb, right? Very light, no physical assets, but they found a way to enter and penetrate these value chain and disintermediate and deconstruct these value chains, right? So what they essentially did was they removed the informational flow from the value chain and said, what is more valuable is not actually having the physical room, but knowing where a room exists and when it is going to be available to whom, at what price, and so on. So just unleashing the value from the informational value chain separate from the physical value chain. And we've seen this happen in a variety of industries. Uber did it in transportation, Airbnb did it in hotel, and you name it. There's new financial service providers that are operating along similar lines in banks and insurance, in healthcare markets. In every market, we've seen new digital natives come and deconstruct value chain. So that's the second shift we've seen. The third shift we've seen with digital innovation is it is democratized commerce. What do I mean by that? If you think of, when new innovations happen, what do I really need? I need knowledge. I need resources and skills to be able to design and deliver the product. I need funding for that. And I need markets, distribution channels and markets to deliver my product or service to the market. Each of those stages, critical stages of innovation, I would argue, have to a large extent be democratized, which allows the small inventor or the small entrepreneur to compete just as if they were a well-established company in all these markets, right? So content and knowledge creation, think of examples like Wikipedia and others where knowledge itself has been democratized, where we've allowed users and think of the number of new clips and videos that are being uploaded onto YouTube every minute, right? Content creation and knowledge creation, Khan Academy and Codecademy are all good examples of democratized knowledge creation. We have similar models for democratized production. Some people call it the Maker Lab and so forth, where people have taken advantage of technologies like 3D printing. If I have a product design idea, I can get it manufactured at fairly low cost. I can get it distributed today through electronic marketplaces, Shopify, Amazon marketplaces, and I can even get it funded through GoFundMe, Kickstarter, and other digital platforms that allow small innovators to come in and just develop very quickly the reach and richness that it has taken established companies years to develop. So a lot of what I call is these combinations of these forces together as the democratized commerce. And this is really, these shifts what it has done is it has dismantled the economies of scale that large companies used to have. We thought of economies of scale simply in terms of access to resources and access to assets that created some sort of a formidable, protection for large firms, right? And they could also spread their costs through larger volumes, led to efficient production, cheaper capital, and so forth. But all of those benefits of economies of scale, I think today are really being changed in many ways by technology, where the more important aspects of scale economies are not because of your size and control of your physical assets, but it has to do much more with the reach and richness you have in terms of your digital platform. How many consumers can I reach? and how many, and with what richness can I, are my offerings being offered, right? And which leads to sort of the next innovation shift that we are seeing in almost all industries is what I call the platformization of business models, right? What we mean by that is companies starting to think about themselves, not just in terms of their product offerings, but starting to think about their business model in terms of a platform-based model where really you want to, what are the core products or services, right? And if I think about a platform, the key elements of a platform are bringing together matching supply and demand, a key aspect or a key function that a platform provides, but also think about the richness layer. As the matching happens, what are the ancillary services? What are the additional sort of value-added services that can be layered on top of this matching? So if you, I don't know if you've rented or offered your home for rent on a platform like Airbnb, and you see a variety of ancillary services, right? From bringing a professional photographer so they can show how your home might look to a potential renter, to all the other transportation services if you're in your new city, from the time you land to getting to the Airbnb location. So an ecosystem of interactions with other partners and so forth that creates the experiential, that creates the customer experience at the time of consumption of the product or the service. And really, if I think about it, where are all these innovations happening? It's really happening in the code, right? In the innovation layer is really built into the platform itself. And that leads me to the last insight. If I think about digital innovation, I think it has been fundamentally about ideas. And so it is no longer, the advantages are no longer accrue from physical assets like it has in the past, or access to physical resources, but it has largely shifted to what I call the intangible capital. But a related research, Nicola, that I'm engaged in is to really look at how do firms capture the value that is encoded. The intangible capital has always been sort of the hardest to measure and the hardest to really capture the value, right? A lot of this intangible capital, it really resides in software code, or it resides in the minds of my employees. How do we actually capture the untapped value that resides in it, in these forms of intangible capital? And I think a lot more needs to happen in terms of even organizational accounting systems and the way financial systems report, because we are still sort of tethered to the old industrial age organizations where the value of a company is still very much measured along sort of the physical assets that they controlled. And I've seen very little and very few companies starting to think about or even put out financial information that relates to their intangible capital. How do I value the software assets? Does it come from, and not all of these software assets are actually patented either. I mean, if you had patents, you could say that could be a source of valuation, but I think a lot more research and a lot more insights need to emerge there.
Anandhi, a question
Yeah.
sort of came through, and it relates to all of these changes. How do you see COVID-19 having an impact on these transformations? In some ways, it feels like it's accelerated them. In other ways, it feels like it has perhaps undermined some of these organizations, these digital native organizations. The Airbnbs, the Ubers. I mean, they've all. It's not been plain sailing for them.
Right. I mean, I think there are two shifts that are happening, right? One with COVID. One is sort of the macro shift that is just sort of a lot of stalled business investments or operations, and that's just because of, and I see that as somewhat temporary till we come out of it and have sort of robust vaccinations and so forth. That will change. But you're absolutely right. I think the second shift that has happened with COVID is really in many ways speeded up the move to digital, right? Even organizations that did not really or did not have as much of their internal operations being digitized or their offerings being completely digital as well, have really, I'm sure went on high gear with COVID to look at their core processes and core transactions and move as many of those as possible to a digital environment. So to the extent to which I can replicate or move my physical processes to digital, regardless of whether I was operating with digital products or not. Can you think of an airline or a company today that does not have robust digital processes, absolutely not being able to conduct, they're not able to conduct any of their business transaction or any of their operations in the digital world, right? So this operational backbone that we were talking about earlier becomes much more of a priority and an absolute necessity today to even survive in a crisis mode like this. So the more coherent my technology stack and the more structured and organized it is, I think that really helps organizations survive this sort of the crisis stage. But simultaneously, and I think here's what I'm saying, that even with sort of this operational excellence, you really need another platform, a second platform, if you will, for experimentation and for new digital offerings. And that's what with all of these shifts that we've seen, maybe not all of these forces are equally relevant for every business in every industry. We talked about the long tail, we talked about the disintermediation of the value chain, we talked about the democratization of content. Maybe not all of these forces are equally relevant, but then I would argue that a majority of those forces are impacting your products, your services, your consumers, your value chain, and your business model. How have I responded? Have I understood these shifts in terms of the ways in which I need to be thinking about my offerings? You asked me earlier, Nicola, about sort of higher education and are we preparing? I would argue that most universities are not even here, right? We don't have a single operational backbone, and across the all of our different segments and different units of a large university, we tend to operate very much in a siloed environment. So the first step is even having a common view of our students and of our other stakeholders as they interact with the university across different units. But more important, but a second part of my argument is that we also need to be simultaneously thinking about not just the operational core, but also about what I'm calling as this digital platform, which is essentially, think of it as sort of a loosely assembled set of components. Here is where, this is my experimental platform, where we think about what might be the new digital offerings that we need to be preparing for, or we need to be introducing. And maybe not all of the data that we need comes from our operational backbone for this. And so we may need new data components. And here's where I would argue, think about a larger ecosystem of providers and partners. You asked me earlier, you said, Nicola, that we don't have the sensors, we don't have the connectivity, we don't have the devices. You're absolutely right. But I think we should know how our students are learning. We only see them in the classroom, but we don't know what are their preferred modes of learning. When they learn, do they get together in small teams and learn? Are they learning individually? When are they learning? What is the best time when they are studying? Do they do it in the evenings? Do they do it in the mornings? Right? Knowing those kinds of data, I think, would allow us to come up with these new offerings that I argue would actually be the sort of what will prepare us for the next 5 to 10 years. And therefore, what kinds of dashboard, what kinds of dials do we need to see in terms of our business components and the corresponding technology or infrastructure that we would need? A lot of this today we don't necessarily have, but these components are available in the broader marketplace, and we need to be thinking about ways in which we can bring them together and start the experimentation and start the journey. We will eventually find that as you make this digital platform much more robust, you will draw on your operational core. It's not to say that that is not needed. I think you still need to survive in the current world, and the left-hand side of this platform is absolutely essential. But we also need to be thinking about the right-hand side, which is my platform for agility, platform for growth. All of the growth in the agility, preparing for the future, is going to come from the right-hand side, even as I operate on the left-hand side with efficiency and with reliability and with robustness. So that really is sort of where I think will lead then to an evolution of new offerings. And that has to come with understanding what are my opportunities to increase connectivity across the business, to think about data and analytics in entirely new ways. And I have to know, what is it about my students or my consumers or my stakeholders that I need to be able to come up with new offers and new business models? How do I unlock the hidden value and look at it in terms of the entire customer engagement cycle, right? The lasting life cycle relationships with our customers, with our partners, with the entire ecosystem. So thinking about it more from a platform sense and building up the platform for future growth and future opportunities. So I'm going to stop and pause.
We have a lot
here
on our plates, Anandhi. There is a question that had come in from Robert Muggleston, who asked, as we collect data and consumer digital footprints, do you see regulations coming to oversee this collection and use? And just for everybody else, please put if you've got a question, please put it into the Q&A or the chat. Yeah,
that's a great question. Absolutely. I absolutely see more regulation coming in. But I'm also, I don't know that, you know, that the regulation and the policy is going to be A, thoughtful, and B, expedient, right? We've seen much more come in Europe, for example, with the GDPR and the protection and the consumer protection rights. I think today's leading corporations should not really wait for regulation, but they should be thoughtful and smart about both the collection and the leverage of data. I think consumers are willing to share the data as long as they know that it is not going to be used for nefarious purposes or used in ways that were not intended. So as much transparency as organizations can provide, if I know that the data, if my healthcare provider is collecting automatically data about my key health parameters, but if I trust the organization to do what is right by me and to be able to give me the signals, the early warning about what I need to change in my life cycle, in my lifestyle, right? I will trust those providers to take it. So I don't think it is consumers will just shut down and say, I am not going to share any of my data, but they have to know that it is done in a manner that is fair, that is transparent, and that the leverage of the data will be within certain boundaries that the consumers themselves are comfortable with. So I think leading organizations will go there on their own and not wait for regulation, because I don't see that coming in any sort of expedient fashion.
And then the other one that sort of is on the back of that is how then do you ensure that your consumers, your stakeholders, your clients actually have trust in you and trust in their data, and that you're protecting that. So that's another whole sort of cybersecurity that has to come into the conversation, correct?
Right. Yeah, it does. It does. I'm not to make it trivial, but I think those are manageable, right? Those are that's I would say, if I think about the stack, that's the technology part of it. And yes, you do need a very robust technology system with cybersecurity and hack and protection and so forth. But the trust part comes from your customer engagement and your business models and your business processes. And that takes a long time to build, and it's easily squandered. But that also goes back to sort of the value and the ethics of the organization, right? Consumers are willing to, if it was, beyond, if it was a macro hack and if it was beyond the control of a single organization, we have seen good companies come through even post some of those experiences, right? But if they have been, and this goes back to sort of the ethics and the value and the transparency, Nicola. It's, yes, you have to invest in those technologies. You have to ensure that you're doing your best to protect the data and so on. But I think it is much more than just having the technology. It is completely about what sort of the ethics and the values that is encoded in your organization. So I keep coming back to the people and the processes, and I think those are key. Beyond the technology stack, I think that's where senior leaders have to spend a lot more time thinking about, how do I build the trust layer?
We've got lots of work ahead, Anandhi.
Absolutely. So yeah, never a dearth. This is always interesting topics to study and talk about.
Thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. We've had a couple of people ask how they can keep the dialogue going. We are so excited to hear that, and we'll be sending you some information on the executive education program, where many conversations like this continue to happen. We'll also be sending the recording out to everyone who registered. So if you want to stay in touch, please reach out to us, and we will find some partners who can keep dialogues moderating and facilitating with you in the coming months. We'll also be sending an update in the next few weeks on how the series will continue. So thank you for registering for this one, and we'll keep you apprised of upcoming events and engagements as well. Again, thank you so much to my partners with the Executive Education Program at Goizueta, and to Professor Anandhi Bharadwaj, sorry, I probably mispronounced that, and for everyone who has participated today. Thank you so much. The recording is going out at the end of the day, and if you have any questions, please do reach out. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye, Nicola. Bye, Lane.
Bye-bye.